Good morning to you, my friends, wherever you may be in the world today. Welcome to my live stream. Alan Clements here on Facebook and my podcast on various podcast distribution networks worldwide. I'm honored to say I have my special guest here today, Susan Barnes, who I've known for some years. And I am both honored and proud to have a conversation with her, primarily listening to her, which I've been honored to do now in the last few days since I've been here in Los Angeles. Her skill set is varied. More specifically, she and her colleagues have started a very unique program, and Susan is the co-founder of the Enlivened Lab, and of course enlivenedlab.com. Check it out for sure. And in looking at her site and talking with Susan these last few days, they offer a program, an immersion, a 4-week immersion program, and it's not open to everyone. It's selected and selective by application only. And please check it out. I've actually been speaking with Susan about my own personal visions and my own developmental understanding of leadership, and I have found it radically fruitful and helpful. She does a Embodied Leadership Immersion. It's an event, a 4-week event that begins, if I'm correct, April 20th. And it's a 4-week program for leaders. Now we're going to get into the meaning of leaders, because we really see in the world today, in my humble opinion, the absence of leadership among so-called leaders. We hear the word frequently, the global elites, like a trans leadership concept, brought forth out of Davos, the uber, super duper, anachronism, if you will, for global totalitarianism. It's hard to know. Leadership today is vacuous. I'll be very blunt about that. And so I'm particularly interested in to hear Susan speak about the attributes of leadership, especially among younger people. And I don't want to get off into a rant here, but I'll get a little bit into that, and I'll introduce Susan and we'll dive into this conversation. Many of you who know me and have known me and have listened to me and talked and read my books and done my shows, I am really at two with toxic male leadership. I'm not saying that it's only in the mind and body of men. It could be in women too, but primarily it's localized in men. And I've been speaking about it for decades, that the best leadership today would be for men to abandon their careers as so-called leaders, unless you're under 40. A whole new generation of people. Men should step aside, especially toxic men in high roles of politics, in military, the United Nations, the Security Council, dictators. Correct me if I'm wrong, when have we had the last female totalitarian zealot, the last female sociopathic dictator? And there's something about men in power that they absolutely corrupt, absolutely. And so I'm very keen to hear Susan's take on gender and the wisdom of leadership and her own views. But this 4-week program for leaders committed to adopting and integrating the tools necessary to confidently navigate and integrate the complex demands of our time. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Susan. And thank you for taking the time today to come over and to speak. And let's start simple. What does embodied leadership mean to you?
Thank you so much for having me, Oren, and hello. Thank you so much for having me, Alan, and hello to everyone that's watching. Thank you so much for joining us. Embodied leadership is multiple components. First and foremost is the actual being in the body and not being disconnected from it. There's, I think, culturally, this romanticizing of and focal point of the intellect and analysis and logic and all of this that's kind of centrally focused here. And most people are, for that reason, very much detached and disconnected from the rest of their bodies. And there's a multitude of reasons for that, aside from the cultural sort of specifications that I've just identified. So it's about getting people back into their bodies as a mechanism of discernment. The other side of that, the other side of that is embodied is also the living, breathing being component. It is the fullness of integrity. And when you were speaking to kind of the leadership models that are in existence currently that we see at grander scales, there's just a lack of integrity across the board. Not just at these high levels, but also just within the smaller, lower level, you're never going to hear about them kind of thing, but that still has significant impact on the way that we live in the world and the systems that we're embedded within as well.
Let me dive right into that. What is the meaning of integrity to you in the role of leadership? Let's define that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think integrity is usually seen as a virtue, which I think it 100% is. But to me, integrity is the antithesis of dissonance. It's complete just harmony of all aspects of self in mind, body, speech, action. And I think that so much of the action and the speech that people are operating from, leaders are operating from, is actually not in congruence with the truth of who they are as a person. And that inner dissonance has wider implications, both seen and unseen, that have such a significant effect because of the position that they find themselves in. And so integrity is the true acknowledgement and honesty about who we are in our moments, how we're showing up, and the ability to, if we notice any sort of dissonance, to actually identify it, speak to it, and then pivot accordingly to come back into that inner coherence.
So along the lines of like social intelligence, emotional intelligence, creative intelligence, mindful intelligence, what would be some of the attributes of, say, embodied leadership intelligence that fleshes out a little bit more, embodies a little bit more the meaning of true to oneself? Because before you answer, it's obviously nothing is a cliche unless you want it to be or make it to be or in denial of it being one. And the truth of one's being is right in there, close to the cliche of authenticity today. I mean, sociopaths can be authentic to the neurosis of their narcissism. You know, and then there's the authenticity of your inner Gandhi, your Martin Luther King, your Mother Teresa. How do we begin to understand the meaning of embodied leadership intelligence so that someone who may be watching or listening who wants to attend your immersion will feel that this is going to be something that awakens me to something I'm not aware of in myself? How do I want to become more dignified, more nimble with truth and transparency, compassion? I lack empathy to the degree to be a real leader. How will Susan Barnes and the Enlivened Labs nurture those issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think we have a template of what it looks like when that's not the case, and we can just look around at the world as we see it, as a living, breathing example of that, of disembodied leadership, of not being with what is as it is. There's so much as a result of being disconnected from ourselves and each other and the greater natural environments that we exist in, that really distort and create particular subsets of assumptions that people, leaders, can action on that are so fundamentally disconnected from everything that they end up creating far more harm than good. And the ability to actually become cognizant of that is first and foremost like the relationship that we are having with ourselves and the capacity of awareness that we can have in terms of the implications of our own actions. And so speaking specifically to the fact that, and we talk about this in the lab itself, is that a lot of people that even see the world as it is and want to make a difference are typically acting from one of two places, either savior complex or warrior complex, both very egoic, right? The ability to be able to even identify that is something that's lost on most people because both of those are actually quite nice archetypes to embody from an egoic state and give purpose to one's life.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality of it is that if you put yourself in a savior position, by proxy of that, you are already creating something and deeming it to be in need of saving, right? And I'm going to say something radical, which I know I can say with you.
You're in good company
right?
for Red.
Is that, you know, there's so many people that are like, I need to save the world. We need to save the world. She's dying. Like this and that. We don't need to save her. She doesn't need to be saved. She's going to shake us right off because we completely lost touch with her and how it is to live in harmony with our natural environment. Not giving more, not taking more than we give, not listening to the very apparent cycles and ecosystems that we're embedded within for us to know our place within it, right? And so there are so many people that are kind of on this trend, like, I must do this, I must save the world kind of thing. But the reality of it is that, like, no, you don't need to save anything. You need to just work on yourself and changing the existing structures that exist within you
Mm-hmm.
for you to become much more connected within to each other and the world that we exist in. And then feel into your place in the midst of all this, because we all have a place. The other side of this is the warrior complex, that this is something we need to fight, like we have to fight this thing, right? But that again is also very obsolete in terms of its thinking, because in fighting something, there is always going to be a winner and a loser. And we've gotten to the point where like we can't engage in those dynamics anymore. We have to be able to expand our complex thinking and organize into higher structures of elegance that can assist us in understanding how to actually optimize for win-win-win as much as possible, right? Like, and so both of these things, right, they're attractive in their allure and like the cape and the costume that I can wear to say that like I am significant in what it is that I'm trying to do. But there's such internal incongruence that isn't even on people's radars because they don't see how deeply entrenched this is masking itself as egoic expression.
Interesting. You know, I'm thinking to myself, which is not uncommon when I'm listening to someone interpreting what's being said and also interpreting my own feelings about what's being said. And that inner dialogue, I would call, in my humble way, mindful intelligence. That's a long-term training, and I want to just circle around to my own sacred, humble training, primarily in the country of Myanmar, Burma, where so many of the people, post-monasticism for me, when I was thrown out of the country by the dictator, bear with me, in 1984, I came back in 1988 underground when Burma's so-called revolution of consciousness, their struggle for freedom and democracy became a predominant theme. The people could no longer take the absence of leadership, aka dictatorship. And so there was a popular revolt by way of saying, jump 20 years, and there's a civilian government led by Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel laureate, who sits today in a prison cell with world leaders who adored her, threw her under the bus. A remarkable friend, and she represents many people, and I'll end with this. So much of their leadership immersion was in a prison cell. They all spent between 10 and 20 years in prison as the incubator of their conscience, their dignity, embodied leadership. And I guess I bring this up to you, Susan, to, I guess in my own indirect, humble way, to question idealism. That unless you really put yourself in the trenches of the meaning of universal human rights, take a leadership off the white collar circuit in America and make it mandatory that that woman running for senator or governor in some particular state go to Yemen, go to Syria, go to Iraq, go to Afghanistan. Look what American weapons do to innocent kids and girls and boys before you sign a bill to kill again, to get your stock option to send your kid to Ivy League school. So immersion trainings are one thing, but like real world training, I mean, what do you bring into your immersion training that you really hope could shape someone into a really caring human being who humbly comes to you and your team? Listen, I'm drunk with narcissism, Susan, which is a rare thing for anyone to say.
For sure.
But listen, all my friends have left me. I have more billions than I could ever spend, but I'm an asshole when I look in the mirror. Help me overcome this stupidity. What goes down in that 4 weeks that really makes a difference in the lives of those people that you select?
Yeah.
And
So
what is the evidence of your success?
yeah, so two things there. The number one thing I would say is that if that person came and approached me, I'm like, at least have a therapist and at least have a somatic therapist that you're working with.
Okay, so
mind and
you're a
body, right?
multidisciplined leader.
Right? So, because it's not just like the one thing, right? Like we exist in too much complexity
Okay, cool.
where it's like one answer is the thing that solves everything, right? Like
Right.
you have to, nothing can be looked at in such a singular generalized way anymore, because that's not the reality of the world that we exist in. And I love the point that you brought in terms of like the, you know, quote unquote dojo of embodiment immersion among leaders was in a prison cell with themselves, right? Like that's the thing, is that, like, you know, so many people are running away from themselves because they don't want to actually face the parts of themselves that they've yet to actually integrate. You know, there's a lot in, I would say, a lot of communities that identify these more darker, shadowy sides of the person, which oftentimes experience some level of neglect because it feels shameful to have. But those are parts of us, and the more that we're compartmentalizing parts of ourselves, the better we are actually at compartmentalizing the truth of the reality that we are existing in.
Interesting. So allow me to back up a little bit.
Yeah.
So in your role as visionary leader, facilitator of cohorts in your immersion, you, on your palette of transformational suggestions to up and coming leaders or leaders who are already leaders but who want to evolve with you, you bring in yoga, psychotherapy, psychedelic dosing regimes, Tai Chi. What is on the palette?
Sure. So I'm going to just kind of give a grand overview. So we created the Enlivened Lab because we saw that one of the many factors that is contributing to the world that we exist in today is the way that leadership has been expressed for a long time in a way that we believe is broken. We believe that leadership is currently informed by cultures of disconnection and production at all costs. We see disconnection as what I mentioned before: disconnection from self, disconnection from each other, and disconnection from the greater ecologies and natural world that we coexist with, as well as production at all costs being a representation of exactly that, without any regard for the consequence to human dignity or our natural environment. And so the leadership immersion, which is called Presence Foundations, is intended to help leaders expand from self-awareness into what we call whole systems awareness, where we recognize that we're a part of an interconnected whole, whether or not that is just the whole systems, that is our entire body, if it's our family systems, if it's our communities, if it's our businesses, or if it's just the natural world that we're living in. Knowing that, like, we all have a place within that, and that there's a greater intelligence that wants to emerge through us if given the space to do so. And this immersion is informed by neuroscience, it's informed by organizational theory, it's informed by chaos theory, it's informed by somatic sciences, in order to give a very holistic approach to, naturally, as a result of the embodiment and practices of these principles, leads to cultures of both connection and co-creation, which is the antithesis to the models of leadership that we currently see today. And so within that, there is, it's 4 weeks. Leaders are really busy. We don't have a lot of time. And the nature of the material that we present is very high level, but there's actually no depth to how far we can go with it, mostly because this expansion from self-awareness to whole systems awareness is something that requires practice. It's an innate shift in being, it's an innate shift in experiencing and living the world in a way that is very antithetical and different than the predominant systems that have been in place for people to just be a cog within a whole system and not feel any agency within that.
Interesting. So clearly you do group work, but you also do one-on-one, face-to-face individual work, correct?
Yes.
Interesting. And help me understand, the word leadership here kind of, I immediately, because of my digital phobia and obsession, I think of Silicon Valley, I think of Washington, I think of the elites.
Yeah.
But leadership here is more pointing to a set of concomitants within the consciousness of everyone.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
So a teenager could come who you apply and
Yes.
accept.
Yes.
A school teacher at Waldorf or some public school could come to learn embodied leadership skills. Is that correct?
100%.
That's good to understand.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, so we look at both, we invite in both emerging and established leaders. From the emerging leaders' perspective, we see people that have already kind of made it in the world based upon the traditional models of success,
Right.
but feel as a result, now that they've gotten to this place and there's nothing really around, they're seeing kind of and have a deeper desire to actually create something or be in the world in a way that is much more showing up as much more being asked of us these days, of like when we look around and we see that the house is on fire, like what could we possibly do to help? And then we look at as well emerging leaders, which are people that have demonstrated very, very clear knowing in terms of what it is that they wish to be doing in the world, and find that any sort of personal success that is divorced from collective well-being is not worth their time.
Interesting.
And so leadership generally, and leaders that we look at, is just anyone that is showing up and that looks around the world at them and says, this isn't working, and has a desire to do something different, despite the fact that they're not actually clear on what the template is to allow them to step into a different type of culture that would be supportive and more life-affirming.
Well, let's just dive right in then. Maybe people who are watching and those who will be watching, who may not have the means or the time to be an applicant to your immersion, is there a everyday version of embodied leadership that you could share for a couple of minutes to those who may be watching, or on how to just, hey, listen, I'm going to carpe diem this space and I'm going to initiate a change based upon Susan Barnes' insights? What would they be?
I'd say the most obvious and overarching would be the recognition that the way that you are operating, the way that you are operating in relationship to other people, and the way that society is operating are all just patterns. They're patterns that have been internalized to such a degree that you've actually embodied very much a lot of different ways that perhaps you're not cognizant of. And that to become an embodied leader and through a vision of new culture that is much more supportive and life-affirming is a recognition that like patterns have to be interrupted. These patterns not only within yourself, but even the relational patterns that you have with other people. A primary example of maybe social relational patterns is the habit that we have of every time we see someone and we haven't seen them in a long time, we catch up with them. We bring the past into our present moment, effectively reliving our past, completely nullifying the rich creative potential that actually wants to arise in the moment of connection as it is so. And it's interesting that this patterning consistently causes us to live in an arrested static state and really kind of squashes any sort of capacity in the moment for what wishes to emerge between these two unique people, this constellation that is inherently creative and life-affirming in and of itself. So that's just one behavioral societal pattern that's widely adopted and widely accepted and not questioned, because it's so predominant, and yet it is such a squandering of and such a I'm going to say a plug in the natural dynamic, like creative shape that sort of is what this all is at the end of the day. And then you can talk about more personal, patterns. Of course, everyone probably knows what their patterns are and what they're trying to change, but fundamentally, the Enlivened Lab is working to assist in the repatterning of culture as we know it, through the identification of these things that aren't necessarily registering in most people's awareness.
Really fascinating.
Because when we become aware, when our awareness begins to expand from just the self, and it begins with the self, into more whole systems, we begin to actually see that the pathology that's kind of underlying a lot of these things naturally. And then we can come into moments of typical exchanges with ourselves, with others, with our businesses, and we can actually create the space for the inherent creative potential that wants to exist in that moment, the space to arise, because we've stepped back into connection, true connection. And the throughway of this is the immersion is called Presence Foundations for a reason. It is how can we support ourselves enough to be as present as possible to the aliveness of our moments, that we can actually listen and understand what wants to arise versus what our conditioned, siloed perspective view of what we think based on past experiences should be occurring. Right? We are inherent fundamentally through our own patterning, our own conditioning, our own traumas, kind of arresting all of this potential that wants to move through. We're stifling it. And so how we can become more of a conduit of that in a way that is wholly generative and life-affirming.
Beautiful. And so would it be fair to say that the quality of consciousness and the concomitance of that state of interruptive or disruptive presence to conformities that diminish potential?
Yes.
What is that state of mind in your understanding that you're pointing to, that I would assume you are offering support, kind of inner mindful asanas, so to speak, to evolve? Is it mindfulness, mindful intelligence, spiritual intelligence, a mixture of all of them? What is it?
So it's actually a fascinating question, because the question itself is already posited in such a way as it to be purely of the mind. And again, like this is embodied, this is embodiment, this is bringing on the full, whole systems aware, full body intelligence into this space of discernment.
Please go on, carry on.
And so, a part of this, a part of the integration and the experience of this embodied leadership and this way of shifting from self-awareness into whole systems awareness is bringing in the significant intelligence of the entire body. When we're thinking about things from a mind state, that mind state by default, just because of the way that we've been brought up, and I'm speaking from American culture specifically, is one in which all of the significant amount of sensory information that we're receiving and parsing through to make sense of our environments is coming through filters. They're coming through past created filters in order for us to make sense of all of this. When we drop just out of the head into the body, there is so much more that our body is telling us in response to the sensory perceptions that we're receiving that doesn't have that same filter. So we're automatically opening ourselves up through the experience of sensation and emotion to a much more refined level of intelligence when we harmonize in this way.
Interesting.
So it's not just the body leading and the intuition and all of that and the sensation, it's allowing both of them to inform each other.
So how would you offer to me, specifically right now, you and I in physical presence, to actualize in a more intimate way what you're suggesting? Alan, you can open up more intimately to the vehicle of your own physicality, your own anatomical sense door. How would you, how do I do that?
Just a few easy things is to initially just reacquaint yourself with your body. For example, so much of what we're typically doing for exercise, be it yoga or running or like going to the gym and lifting weights, is our patterned responses. So they're already pretty deeply grooved into your neural pathways. Like they're already pretty strict there. And so one of the best things that we can do immediately that begins to have an effect on our own capacity is movement that originates from different parts of your body. So we cultivate deeper listening, because our body can tell us what it likes and what it doesn't like. We're more familiar with like what it doesn't like because we'll feel pain, right? We'll tweak something. But we're also familiar with what feels really good, like when we stretch in the morning. There's a feedback that we know that this feels really good. And so if we're able to get out of our head and kind of just drop in and start to move our body with the points of movement or originating from different parts and listening to what it wants and moving it, we can actually create a bottom-up approach that reorients and creates new neural pathways. So we're already starting to create and again come back into wholeness with ourselves.
It's like a quantum qigong.
Sure, that's a great name actually for it. Quantum qigong is a great name for it. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I would say, like, Google all the different types of feelings you can have and all the different types of bodily sensations you can have. Because once you begin to have awareness around and a lexicon around your own inner landscape, then you can begin to make distinguishing identifications of when certain sensations arise in relationship to something. And you can begin to hear yourself better and listen better, and refining this sort of intimacy with your own internal landscape over time and developing language with it over time allows you to become a much more effective communicator, not within just yourself, but with others, in a way that you can start noticing things on a much greater scale. The more subtle aspects of information that we're coming into contact with you'll begin to notice are eliciting particular responses in your body. And over time, you can create a map, right? So on a very like overt scale, most people talk about intuition as like a gut thing, right? Like it's a very strong gut sensation that people have. And that's like the most predominant, identifiable, culturally relevant, and like thing that you could probably drop into and be like, yeah, I know what it's like when I've had like an intuitive moment and I followed it, and also when I didn't follow it, right? That's like the overt aspect of self. But there's so much more signaling that's happening that we can pick up on if we begin to pay attention. And by accessing our whole body's intelligence in this way and having it harmonize and work together, when we are in communication, when we are in relationship, when we have to make decisions about things, we're picking up on far more information from our lived experience of our body and knowing and identifying what we come into contact with that can actually support us in helping what wants to move through versus what we want, like what we're charging and trying to create based on past patterning, but what actually creatively through us in connection wants to arise in the moment. And this is how we begin to harmonize within whole systems. This is how we fundamentally discern where our place is amongst all of it in a way that is fundamentally life-affirming, because the information that we're receiving is not just like from us, it's from this living organism that we are connected with, that is dictating so much and holding so much and is harmonizing with us if we listen, right? And so there's so much nuance and complexity to this, but the beginnings of it is like just through presence of what's transpiring in our own dynamic inner states.
Very interesting. I'm listening through, obviously, both my ear, my filters, my mind, but you're speaking my language, because let me just back up a second. I just came from 8 months in Hawaii on Maui, and one of the things that I did there was to go into what I called my Allen Sacred Silent Retreat. And I dieted, I fasted intermittently, I used extracts, I meditated. As I said earlier, I was microdosing and dosing with various psychedelic substances on a fairly frequent basis. But more specifically, I was sensitizing to a new presence besides the presence that I had brought into my life on Maui. And so I chose to walk a lot in nature, but without shoes for the first time. And for 8 months, I would walk in this particular area of the forest on sand without shoes, without a shirt, alone. And it's like, my goodness, we kind of commune from a distance, because that's exactly what I was doing. I was listening to things that were so disruptive to what I'd been told, what I was led to believe, the cultural narrative of medical assessments, age assessments, time assessments, everything was being questioned through the filter of propaganda and pornography. And I became naked. Not to say that I achieved pure nakedness, but there was something exactly what you're attuning to that I instinctually did there, and I'm trying to continually do. It's interesting that you and I have met again, and that you're speaking this language. It's so inspiring. But I guess my point is that I had never seen, and I'll end here, but I'd never seen in my humble years of life a more radiant experience of meditative presence and awakening. Even during my years as a monk, I felt more alive in the Dharma of monasticism just last year than ever 30 years and 40 years ago as a monk in Burma. And a lot of it came to exactly what you're pointing to. And it's so easy to hear the word embodied, right? Like authentic, but boy, I am so trusting the language of you and I connecting about embodiment here, because I'm learning words and language and wisdom that I had not heard in myself. That this is not a valid vehicle, this is an essential vehicle. So just to reflect back that I'm in your camp in that regard. And the question one becomes, again, for people who may not be able to participate in your immersion, how can they hear this and immediately integrate some of the wisdom that you offer, you and your colleagues at the Embodied Labs, Enlivened Labs, .com, by the way. How can they take what they already do and increase the fidelity and the sensitivity of diet, health, yoga, whatever? What are some of the ways to listen more intimately through the non-filter of a more pure body?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to it again and again, because this is the immersion itself. It's presence. It's really just.
Would you bring some life to the word?
Yeah.
Again?
Yeah.
You have been brilliantly, but
Yeah.
a little bit more.
Sure. The only way to really plug into what is actually being called for in every single moment is to be with the moment with the fullness of your attention and awareness. Most of the time, most people are either here or there or somewhere else. Like they're stuck in the past and they're seeing everything with a lens of the past, or they're looking into the future scenarios and impressing both of those upon the moments that they're a part of and not actually really privy to what is happening. And the way that we become embodied leaders is by fully being with each moment as they are arising to the fullness of our capacity, right? It's different for everyone.
Right.
But the way that we're able to shift from self-awareness into whole systems awareness is through presence. It's literally being with everything as it is and doing our best not to usurp it with our own limited understanding of what all this is, without making assumptions and projecting those assumptions onto the moment. There's a quality to deep listening, and this is presence is supportive of deep listening, and deep listening is supportive of presence. And the way to access presence is by just listening, just sitting in stillness with yourself, and just being with everything that's coming up in you, which can be very difficult because there's a lot of complexity that we are swimming in on a personal basis, and there's a lot of discomfort in that. But that's where we need to lean into, is the discomfort that can invariably arise as a result of being with what is, what is really transpiring in the moment. And that's one of the hardest things, because it's hard to be with what is. It's really hard. If we're really being honest here about everything, the state of the world that we find ourselves in, the state of the isolation and the breakdown of communication and polarization within this country.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to walk down a sidewalk and see multitudes of people without homes,
Mm-hmm.
all of the pathologies that are all the symptoms of a pathological culture that we exist in. It's very hard to be with what is. Not to mention all the general humanist stuff like death and dying. And there's a lot of discomfort. There's a lot of emotional discomfort. There's a lot of mental discomfort. And the mechanisms that we have grown into over time to assist us in compartmentalizing these things
Mm-hmm.
are what is keeping us from actually being within life-affirming structures. And so deeply listening to what is real in the moment is hard, but that's also what is so necessary right now, because that's the only thing that's true. And so, yeah, sorry. To wrap that up, deep listening and presence as the gateway into whole systems awareness. It begins here. It begins here in the structuring of self-integrity, of really being honest with what is real and true, because most people are denying that. Most people are ignoring that. And the more we can come into that wholeness, the more integrous we become within self, and the more that just naturally ripples out in the way that we're connecting with others and the choices that we're making.
Interesting. You know, I was talking to a friend the other day about a biopic done by the radical psychiatrist who passed away, Artie Lang, called Mad to Be Normal. And of course, he brought forth the concept that insanity was a sane response to an insane world.
For sure.
J.K. Krishnamurti said it's no measure of success to be adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And so we have a degree of normalization of perversity.
Yes.
To state the obvious, war has become peace, Big Brother, right?
Yeah.
Incarceration is called human rights. And so many people in leadership roles present themselves as democratic leaders, and they're really just fascist, Stalinistic dictators with, a suit. Now, on a more relative level, lots of people, myself, I left this town 50 years ago to ordain in the country of Myanmar, and I adapted by a very elegant, self-destructive set of beautiful addictions. It was never one thing. I look back at that time, and it's going to lead to the question, at how skillful I was that I was able to adapt to a carnivore, capitalistic, competitive prison camp. It was so anathema to me for doing decades of meditation, yoga, and psychedelics to think that this was my future. And so I adapted by addictions. And addictions have gotten a really bad rap. I think that they are the genius madness to survive insanity. And those who are successful in insanity are psychopaths. I think Biden's a psychopath. I think Xi Jinping in China is a psychopath. I think Stalin's a psychopath. Putin's a psychopath. The list goes on. Klaus Schwab at Davos is a psychopath. Why? Because they pride themselves on power, privilege at all costs, and murder at the expense of, fill in the blank with whatever XYZ you want. So my question is, people come to you, you're a smart person, clearly articulate, nuanced. My obstacle to hear my body is these things that I'm doing, called going to work every day. I like my job but don't love it. The option is a kind of what? Vax, non-vax. Biden, Trump, who to believe? The addictions to confusion, the addictions to money, the addictions to masturbation, the addiction to voting against your conscience. How do you suggest to people to, one, see their unrecognized addiction filters, and what are some of the tools that you might employ in your workshop with your colleagues on the leadership intelligence model to challenge the habit of comfort, discomfort called the addiction, the habit? If the question's clear, maybe there's some things you could offer people, because so many people I know, they're addicted to health, they're addicted to longevity, they're addicted to their vitamins and their extract. They're addicted to food at the time that they want it. And being a monk at times, some of the greatest struggles were people who were wealthy and affluent who came to the monastery. They could not sit for 10 minutes and just simply be in the process of feeling their body. So I leave it to you. What are some of the ways to handle the restlessness, the worry, and the addiction to my lifestyle?
That's that question. There's a multitude of answers to that. First and foremost, I think that if you have like the ability to do so, a really good therapist is necessary. Like it's just really necessary. If there's that much of a struggle in the day-to-day, that someone who is licensed professional, who is trusted, is like a non-negotiable. Again, like I bring in somatics, a somatic therapist as well, because so much of what we're experiencing is not just our mental state, but the state of our body, because they're inseparable. Sometimes the mental anguish is so much that it is expressing fully as some overwhelming sensation, which is why there's a desire to turn away from it. Addiction, as you had mentioned it, to me also just directly translates to like a need for control, which is actually quite reasonable, I would say, in a world that is so fast, with so many different types of current existential crises, that there is something that someone would want to hold on to as the illusion of having control over it, because it creates some stability. But that's invariably fighting against the truth of the nature, which is that we really don't have control over much. We have control over our own like sort of bodily sensations and functions, like depending upon the degree of freedom that we have, like we're able to go and make our own food. But there's something more deeply psychological that's happening as a byproduct of something underlying that is fueling that. And if it's the textbook addiction, that there is a need that is being filled because if in some response to something that is emerging within a person that clearly they don't have the support or capacity to just be with, right? And because that isn't readily available, then the only other option is to return to something that is familiar, to give a sense of control, to interrupt something that is too much. And so, you know, if anyone is experiencing anything at this point in time that is along sort of these lines, and you can get help professionally, I would highly recommend it. But also recognize that like there's nothing wrong with you. Like there really is nothing wrong with you. Like we are born into such extraordinary conditions that are so much more far complex at an accelerant rate than any of human history at all, that it's a wonder that we're even functioning, right? Like it's a wonder that we're functioning. And the only reason that we exist as we do is by fundamentally suppressing and denying many parts of ourselves. You know, and this can start very young with trauma and conditioning as a maladaptive coping mechanism. But also, like, it's hard in this current world that we exist in to not participate in the systems that we are so fundamentally against, because there's really no viable alternatives that exist in a widespread, cheap way. Yeah. So we're kind of stuck, right? Like, we know that we want to do better, but I have to drive my car that consumes gas, that creates carbon emissions, that destroys life, that is contributing to climate. Like, it's inescapable.
This begs the question that urbanization needs to be canceled. The end of cities. I mean, it's radical, but survival is based upon not colluding with extinction-inducing behaviors. For sure. I mean, we're at the precipice, if not over it, according to the minds that really know. Yeah. I mean, let me ask you this question, because we're coming close to the end here. I could just go on and on. We're going to have Susan back. You got to check her workout, the Enlivened Lab, enlivenedlab.com. Yes. Correct?
Yeah, /presence. If you feel a connection to what we're speaking to here and you want to be considered to be part of the immersion, you can apply there. We are science-informed, science-backed, nature-informed in terms of our model, and diversity, as we see nature thrives in diversity, we too try to keep our pools of leaders as diverse as possible from a wide range of background, discipline, industry, because we do better when we have far more information to be confronted with, and homogenization is usually the literal death of everything. Anything that's homogenized, you can look at monocropping, for example, and any sort of thought that is static and homogenized is not at the level of complexity that is natural and required, especially at this junction in time. So enlivenedlab.com/presence if you want to apply for consideration.
And that immersion is starting on April 20th?
Yeah, April 20th.
Okay, 4 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
2 questions,
Yes.
if I may.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you personally find hope today?
I find hope in the youthful generation, for sure. I have a belief that every generation that is born is more evolved than the one prior, and I think that they are ripe for, and they are so much more adept and wise in the world that we're navigating, and so I have hope there. And I would say also, I have hope in this, like just in this connection, in the different conversations that I'm having with so many people that are all so aware and full of heart, and that know that there's no true way to know what our future holds, but are still doing the things that they know can be supportive of trying to balance out this crazy world that we're in. That's what gives me hope.
Thank you. And I dare use the word final question. I don't like the sound of that.
Mm-hmm.
But, as the adage goes, speaking truth to power, and to state the obvious, that within the interconnected world, environmentally, psychically, digitally, and that no one is an island, everywhere is everywhere together, we're in some kind of crazy oneness. Mm-hmm. Either it's going to be an evolution of a miracle or the death of it, or both, I don't know. Mm-hmm. By way of saying that, what would you say if you had, say, a few minutes to talk to, men in power, mm-hmm. women in power, mm-hmm. our president in the Oval Office, the United Nations, like our young Greta Thunberg addressing the UN in 2019. I want no more of your fantasies of endless economic growth. Mm-hmm. You've got a couple of minutes in front of the United Nations, wired to the world. Mm-hmm. Every world leader is going to stop drinking their champagne, stop pressing the button of future murder. Mm-hmm. Putin's going to stop. The president of Ukraine is going to stop for a minute. Everyone's going to stop and listen to Susan Barnes. What would you say to these people if you had a couple of minutes speaking truth to power?
That we always have and will always belong to each other on our earth. We will always belong to each other. We are so inseparable that any sort of lashing out or any selfish endeavor will catch up to you, will catch up to the rest of us. That there is no glory after you pass away. There's no glory after the imagined legacies that you're creating. It all ceases when you cease to be. And so what is it that you're actually building towards? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And at what cost? Imagine that it was for nothing. Just imagine that it was for nothing, because it all is for nothing. It's a quick blip of our existence in time. And then we're nothingness, like the vastness of our universe. And remind yourself as being so insignificant. Regardless of how inflated your ego might become in thinking that you are so significant, you are not. You will return to dust, like everyone returns to dust. And what will be said on the lips of many after you go.
Beautiful. Thank you. From my heart to yours, thank you for taking the time. EnlivenedLab.com, Susan Barnes. Not just check she and her colleagues out, acquaint yourself with their essential work and be moved enough to risk whatever obstacles there may be seen or imagined, and apply to join her in the future of freedom. And so from my heart to yours, thank you for tuning in. May I invite you to do, if you so feel moved, to share this. And if you would like personal contact with Susan, her own personal website, likewatersheflows.com, and do as I've done, talk to this savant, feel, grow, and take these lessons into the future. On a personal note, many of you know, but just as a reminder, I've written a few books in the last few months, a young children's book called Tonight I Met a Deva, an Angel of Love. I'm quite honored to say that it's almost completely done. The video trailer, all the press releases, the book has been written. It's up on Amazon worldwide, Barnes & Noble. It's in pre-order. I rarely ever talk too much about my work, but the children to me are my passion. Not just my own daughter, but the about to be born. The forces of life in the womb of eternity in all dimensions, the inheritors of our presence, as Susan mentioned. So may I encourage you to tell your school, your library. It was a book written to bring the parent and the child into a dialogue over years, not just to be read to put someone to sleep. I think if there's a downside to the book, it will keep the child awake. It was never meant to be psychedelic on a page, but I think it is. And I wrote another book with my friend and colleague, the Reverend Bodhi B, called Facing Death. It's an extended conversation that he and I had on Maui. It's coming up soon. It's in pre-order. And I've put together, along with many friends over the last 2 years, which we just released, the World Dharma video book, 37 chapters, 10 hours, 61 small installments of a minute each. The pragmatism of my own 50 years of folly and growth along this jagged edge called the spiritual human life. So hope to see you down the road. I'll continue this special guest series as I feel it, and occasionally I'll do a live stream here and there where it's moving to me. So from my heart, have a beautiful day, and may you share this video if you feel moved. Thank you. And thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Alan.